Okay. So, um, despite most of you not being here last time, um, I did still have to record for my online class. So we did move ahead a little bit in the notes. Um, so we did go through the uh, beginning of the. Wow, my brain just shut off. I'm in the wrong part of the book anyway. The Great Awakening. That's it. So, um, I'll be putting the PowerPoint up on Blackboard probably by the end of the day because we'll more than likely be finishing the chapter today, so you can look over anything you missed. Um, so just FYI that I had to do that because I had online classes to do. So, um, and also I actually had a student come in, so we we had class. Um, last Wednesday. Anyway, oh, I'm on the wrong there. So we ended last time with we were kind of halfway through this section. Um, spoke about George Whitefield, who was like there were a lot of people involved with the Great Awakening. George Whitefield was probably like the main guy, if you want to choose a main guy for this. Um, he used expanding methods of communication and travel, which is to say, like ships and stuff that were used for commerce to spread the uh, the revivals. He traveled back and forth to North America 7 times over the course of his career, which, if you recall, it takes like a month to get from England to North America, and that's not an entirely safe trip. Not just from storms and whatnot, but like it's real easy to die of disease just on the trip from Europe to North America. So that's a heck of a thing going back and forth that many times. And then in his 1739 to 1740 trip, he made 350 stops, which is crazy. Um, 1739 to 1740, because that's probably over the course of about a year, maybe a little bit more. Um, and that's 350 stops. That's nearly a stop a day. That's insane. And also, he drew crowds as big as 20,000 when cities the size of Boston, which was one of the biggest cities in North America at the time, had about 17,000. So he was drawing crowds bigger than the entire population of the biggest cities at the time, which again, it it's hard to it's hard to fathom for people at that time. You didn't have crowds like that. Um, and again, it's one of the differences in um, the Great Awakening and his religious movements before this. Um, they oftentimes focused not on the denomination, but on just core beliefs. Now, granted, this was still like not Catholic preaching. This was specifically Protestant, but despite as much as Protestantism had split since the Protestant Reformation, um, this was mostly interdenominational preaching. And then, of course, it was a lot to do with the disenfranchised. Um, you apparently had to pay rent to sit at the front of the wealthy churches. So that was the thing. Um, and the churches back then were not built with acoustics in mind. Like today, if you've ever been in a completely empty church, you can tell that there are acoustically built, like they're specifically built so if you're standing on the stage in the middle, everyone can hear you. You don't even need the speaker system, realistically. Um, there was also, more people being a Christian and people being born again into more passionate Christianity. And also, while there was, of course, plenty of interdenominational preaching, most of it was within each denomination. And while this wasn't necessarily like trying to keep the denominations apart, where they're like, oh, well, you can't trust these other guys, it was more that they were strengthening their own denomination, or more specifically, like their own local church. But at the end of the day, it was still this big re-energizing of religion. So, this is an image that I use for this specifically, and it's a pretty decent way to show that this was different from the old style of things. And I mean, it's kind of hard to say, but this was a pretty diverse crowd for the time. I mean, you've got not just some of these folks that are fairly wealthy, but you've got this guy that's clearly like straight out of a tavern, probably works in the harbor. He's probably on his second or third glass. You've got women here, which again, like, you can't have women. Some of them older and probably not too well off in terms of wealth, just gathering around and listening to, I believe this is supposed to be Whitefield, preach. Also, I should, bump the mic again. I'm gonna ask you guys, see who in here can suss this out. So, like I said, the churches back then weren't really built with acoustics in mind. But even if they were, they couldn't hold, I mean, this isn't a crowd of 20,000, obviously, but this was how this was done. Dude got up on a box and was in the middle of like a field, and the field was filled with as many people as could fit. There wasn't like a stadium, or like in the case of, say, Greece and Rome, like an amphitheater, which was also had acoustics so that people could hear way in the back. So, with that in mind, how could a crowd of 20,000 people hear a dude standing on a box? How do you think back in the 1700s they were able to make it so that people further back in the crowd were able to hear what this guy was saying? Because again, they're in a field, so acoustics isn't going to be the answer. Sorta. I mean, you can only yell so loud, and these guys are not going to have a short message. And if he's doing it like every other day, that's not going to be sustainable. But you're close, because that's like half the answer. There's a relay system where in the crowd you have other guys that work with the preacher, and typically they know about how far his voice is going to reach without him absolutely tearing apart his vocal cords. And they'll stand, usually also on platforms, and then they'll repeat it further into the crowd. And if it's a really big crowd, they'll have like another set of relay guys out further. So it's like a really primitive speaker system. but it's just a relay where he'll say whatever he said, and then they'll repeat it further out. So yeah, um, obviously that's not going to be on any kind of test. I just like to bring that up for how one dude managed to speak to a crowd of that big, uh, which is that's not something that was invented at this time. That's been a thing for as long as we've had lots of people gathering. But it's just something I thought I should bring up. It's pretty cool. So there was quite a bit of support with this early on. There was a lot of um, religious fervor. Um, Religion had been in decline. It was getting a major boost. It was like uh, the topic of the day. However, a major point of these revivals was the critique of the educated clergy and the established norms, which obviously didn't sit well with the established clergy that have been running the show for the last few hundred years. And then, as I briefly mentioned previously, there's the issue of women, slaves, and natives being welcomed to the revivals, encouraged to partake in almost equal measure to men, which upset a lot of the traditionally minded clergy, as well in the North and the South, because if you're letting these people that aren't white men be treated as almost equals in these revivals, then they might start thinking they're almost equals elsewhere. Can't have that. And then we move on to probably my favorite guy, James Davenport. He was intense. So he's got a quote. I mean, I just copied this straight out of the book because it's real good. He told people in Boston, I'll just go ahead and say here, drawing thousands of colonists to Boston Common day after day, Davenport declared that the people, quote, should drink rat poison rather than listen to corrupt, unconverted clergy. So yeah, that's what he thought about the clergy, the established clergy. So, claiming that Davenport's followers were, quote, idle or ignorant persons, and those of the lowest rank, Boston officials finally called a grand jury into session to silence him, quote, on the charge of having said that Boston's ministers were leading the people blindfold to hell. So yeah, Davenport got in trouble for upsetting the status quo. Now, while you had this sort of stuff going on with Davenport, you had other guys. Tennant here, he was one of the main guys we talked about last time, along with a dude with a long Dutch last name that I don't feel like trying to say again. Rather than splitting denominations apart, he actually helped to reunite the New York and Philadelphia Presbyterians, because that's actually a common thing among Protestant sects, and even just like churches, is that they'll have some disagreement over something, and the church will just split. They'll just, one side will go one way, one side will go the other way, and they'll just form their own churches and have some slight name change, and now you've got two different churches of basically the same branch. I mean, I can see with New York and Philadelphia because they're two different regions. Although with that, it was probably like a minister thing. Still, though, even after all this died down, um, there was quite a bit of passion and fire behind the American religious doctrine, and yeah. Now, granted, there will be a second Great Awakening in, I think, the 50s. I don't remember exactly when the second Great Awakening was. I want to say that was Billy Graham's fault. It was this whole like anti-communist hysteria thing, I think. But yeah, this was the first one. Anyway, again, despite this being bleh, there being this whole, revival of religion, not everybody agreed with this. We have this image here that's actually in the book for anybody that actually has their hands on the book. It's called Dr. Squintum's Exaltation of, or the Reformation. They were also calling the Great Awakening the Reformation. Basically, I'll just read this from the book. For one, the reason they called, by the way, this is supposed to be George Whitefield. So, again, same guy, George Whitefield. Satirizes George Whitefield and his followers. The title highlighted an eye disease that left Whitefield cross-eyed. So they called him Dr. Squintum because he was cross-eyed. Like, wow, let's just go ahead and insult him just from the start. Image shows an imp and fame hovering on either side of Whitefield's head. So you can see, like, they're pouring ideas into his ears. While the devil rakes some money below his podium, on the left, Whitefield's followers are seen with a prostitute, while others are shown shoving a mother and child and taking food from a poor woman. So, his followers are seen as basically thieves and miscreants and whatnot. And, like, in some cases, literally, like, dog-faced. I don't know. There's a lot happening. 1700s are weird, y'all. Yeah, so even within Protestantism, lots of petty squabbling. So while the Great Awakening is often seen as there's this huge revival of religion all across America, sorta. Obviously, the people who were in charge weren't too pleased with it. Alright. And now I think this is the last section of this chapter. Yeah. And then we can move on to chapter 5. Some political stuff, which, I know this politics aren't super exciting, but it's important for where we're going. So most settlements were typically regulated by rich white men because, again, America. Well, it's an Anglo-Saxon settlement. As we're expanding geographically and the population is booming, it's more complex than just, hey, we got like Jamestown and Boston and Plymouth, and that's basically it. They had to do more to keep their authority. And technically, on paper, authority lay with the king and Parliament. And more specifically Parliament, because the king was like equal with Parliament, but whatever. And they appointed royal officials that could technically come in and veto any locally elected officials. Locally elected officials were just there because, as I've said many times, it takes a month to get over the Atlantic and a month to get back. And if there's like an issue over here and we have to send a ship to, a message has to go on a ship. So you have to send a whole ass ship to Britain to tell them something's going on. And they have to deliberate in Parliament over what to do. And that's not going to be short. They aren't very fast in in Parliament. They aren't any faster in Parliament than we are here in Congress. And then they have to send that back. So it's going to be at least 2 months, probably more like 6, to make a decision. And on top of that, besides being too far removed, which is what I just went over, they're in London. London was like one of the most urbanized cities in the world at the time. Now, again, this is like really super early Industrial Revolution, to the point that we were not feeling that at all over here. They were sort of doing it over in England at the time, and this is like really early proto, not even steam power yet, Industrial Revolution. So don't have that in mind just yet. But London was very far removed from the colonies in terms of development and urbanization, versus we're basically in the wilderness over here. Even our most developed and populous cities are, compared to London, like in the woods. Also, we had gotten used to having our own little local governments. Town meetings, representative bodies, like the House of Burgesses in Virginia. And we didn't really want to listen to local officials, or not local officials, royal officials. We were stubborn. Now, this isn't like, oh, well, this is because we were American and we wanted to be independent. That's not until way later. Now, this is kind of sort of like a step in that direction, but it's just because, I mean, look at any British colony. The British are just stubborn, like, by nature, and then they act confused when they put people somewhere and they're there for several generations, and then they try to tighten their hold, and people there are like, no, we don't like that. You're British. What do you think is going to happen? Look at anything in India or anything in Australia or freaking Ireland. So yeah, the British assumed that they could come in and just tell the colonists what to do, and the colonists would be like, okay, yeah, well, you're royal officials, so obviously you know best. Not really. And as we've seen over the last several chapters, with like Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson, events like the Stoner Rebellion and the Salem Witch Trials, and the whole religious fervor with the Great Awakening, and specifically James Davenport, royal authority didn't really have a lot of power. And not so much didn't have a lot of power, but like it wasn't well respected. People were going to be individuals. People were going to do their own thing. And while these events were very widespread in terms of where they were and when they happened, it still did show that the North American colonies were not super orderly. It was a little bit chaotic here, and again, it's funny that the British think that they can like strictly order colonies across the Atlantic Ocean when they, for several centuries, haven't been able to strictly order the island right next to them. The Irish have been their own thing for as long as the English have existed, so good luck with that, guys. I mean, hell, they've technically ruled over Scotland for several centuries, and the Scottish are still their own thing. Like, you can't say, well, the Scottish are just British. Like, they're really not. Have you ever talked to a Scotsman? They're their own thing. So here we have like the spread of the population, again, mostly up here in the northeast, and then around the Chesapeake Valley. And then a little bit down here in the south. These areas down here typically stayed, in terms of population, fairly barren. mostly around Charleston and Savannah, and then gradually we made our way up some of the rivers. But for the most part, it was just like small farms and a few big plantations, and then these port cities. For the most part, up here is where you got the big stuff. And by big, I mean relatively. All right. So by the 1700s, 1730s specifically, um, there started to become a pretty major pattern of protest against the colonial elites. And colonial elites typically were British. Now, granted, again, these are British colonies, so everybody's technically British, but I mean, like, these were royal authorities sent from Britain to ensure um, everything's being run properly. So, yeah. One of the main reasons for these protests was the price of bread. This happened a lot, especially in Europe, um, because most people barely made enough to survive. That's how it's always been. Um, and bread was the basic staple food. You survived based on the price of bread. And if the price of bread went up, you couldn't afford to eat anymore. And starving will make you do whatever you need to do to survive, especially if you have kids, and most people have kids. So, yeah, you do what you need to do. This in particular, the price of bread rose while grain prices dropped. Couple of weird things about that. One, most of the people who were barely surviving and to get by were farmers and were growing grain. So they're not only are they having to pay more for food, but they're also making less now. Also, though, why is the price of bread going up while the price of grain is going down? Because you make bread out of grain? I don't know what that's about. I don't understand. I don't get economics if that's what's going on. So oftentimes there will be these large protests outside of granaries or bakeries, oftentimes led by women, because they were the ones that were typically the ones out there buying the food for the family. They tended to work in the short term. The prices would drop again and then gradually make their way back up. But that usually wouldn't be as bad because the economy would have stabilized a little bit by then and people were making enough to survive. There's one such bread riot in Europe where rather than like actually threaten anybody, the people just like march into the bakery and just pretend like they hadn't heard that the bread prices have risen. And when you have 30, 40, 50 people in your bakery, all that have been working in the fields their entire lives, which is to say they could break you in half, and they're like, hey, the bread's this price, right? Yeah, the bread's whatever price they want it to be. So, yeah, that usually was how these went. If not, they were burning down cities and stuff because like they didn't play around. Because when there were peasant riots, that was like 90% of the population. There was all this issue of public markets in Boston. So think of like a farmer's market today, but in the middle, in like downtown, which again, downtown back then was like where farmers markets are today. However, in 1737, Boston officials decided to charge a fee for farmers setting up their stalls. And as I've said several times, the farmers were barely making enough to get by anyway. And these fees would essentially either make it so they weren't making any money at all or they were losing money just setting up their stalls. Because, of course. So they wrote petitions to the Boston officials, and obviously the officials didn't care because who cares what the lower class thinks? So overnight, these stalls were completely destroyed, and nobody saw anything. And I would like to, I would really like to emphasize that. This was the middle of Boston. Sure, it was overnight, but I mean, people are around at night. And this was a very public place. These stalls were destroyed, clearly not quietly, but nobody saw anything. What do you know? This is weird. Nobody saw anything. Yeah, that's what we're looking at here. Is that it got to the point that basically everybody was working against these colonial elites. Maybe not necessarily destroying the stalls, but they weren't going to snitch. They had nothing to gain by helping the officials out. They hated them as much as everybody else did. And this is going to come up again as we move on. So this sort of thing sticks around. Speaking of things that are going to stick around, impressment. So this is something you definitely need to know. Boop. So impressment is a term for the forced drafting of colonial men into the Royal Navy. I think it's still a thing. It's probably not illegal. Well, I mean, it's draft. You could be drafted into the Navy. But this wasn't like you weren't on a register and it's like, hey, congratulations, your name's been chosen, you're in the Navy now. They would just show up in a port city, grab you, and drag you onto a ship. Congratulations, you're in the Navy. Which was pretty common because Britain was always at war and had a massive navy and was constantly at need for more sailors. And I mean, also had this huge empire, so needed to have ships all over the world at any given time. But no one wanted to be in the Navy because, as I've said many times, if I've said it once, I've said it a million times, being on ships in the 1700s sucked. Not just because, hey, you're in the Navy, you might die of getting shot in the face by a cannon. No, there's a much better chance of you just dying of some horrible random disease. Or in the case of the Navy, hey, all our food's gone bad. We'll get more food in like a month. Good luck. Enjoy the maggot-ridden stale bread. Or, oh hey, seems like our water has gotten polluted. Enjoy that. So, in 1747, when the Royal Navy came in to try and grab people in Boston, the folks in Boston fought back, which that's kind of intense. They fought back against the Royal Navy sailors who were coming in to grab people. And what's interesting about this is like they weren't grabbing people out of their homes. They were typically grabbing like vagrants or drunks in taverns, like lower class people that, I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, but that most of society wouldn't miss. But by this point, the Bostonians had it and went to fight the Navy over this. So here we have the bread riots. I don't know why every woman in this is like drawn in a different style, but there you go. And here we have See, engraving for Oxford Magazine, so this is specifically in London. The press gang or English liberty displayed, and this was a common thing back then. Whenever they did speech bubbles, they did it sideways. So, yeah, thanks for that, England. But yeah, it's showing people a man getting dragged off to join the Navy, and his wife or sister or whoever is begging them to stop, but they're obviously not. And I've got more images of this later on because we're going to talk about impressment more later. But they're not just carrying these sticks around for fun. They will beat you over the head and drag your unconscious body to the ship. So you might wake up at sea and be like, "Hey, good morning. You're on the ship. You're part of the Navy now." Or I guess the proper thing would be, "Hey, you're finally awake." All right. So, as I said, a lot of these protests were cross-class alliances. Most of the time, these things typically only affected the lower class, so the middle and upper classes left it alone, but eventually the middle and sometimes upper classes would band together with the lower classes against the royal elites. So there was an event in New York City after 1731 that even changed how the politics worked there. And there's a lot here. You don't need to know all these names. What you need to know, though, is this guy, Peter Singer. He was the publisher of the New York Weekly Journal. He accused Cosby, who was the royal official running for governor of New York Colony, against the guy that was who was running for governor by the people, ended up losing. He was accused of corruption, election fraud, and tyranny, which, needless to say, was not well received by the royal government. He was jailed for libel, which was illegal if it undermined government authority, whether or not it was true. So, even if this guy had done all these things, if he had been engaged in corruption, election fraud, and tyranny, it doesn't matter, because saying all this was undermining government authority, which is weird, because it seems like some people in the government want to go back to the way this was done, so you can't even say that they're doing things that they're doing because it's undermining authority or whatever. Anyway, yeah, what the hell? What's going on? Securitas. I'm not talking about my security job. Anyway, and the reason this is important is Andrew Hamilton of Philadelphia argued that truth must be recognized as a defense against libel. So if you're telling the truth, no matter how bad it is, that it should be defense against being sued for libel. So if you say something outrageous about somebody, but it's true, then you shouldn't be punished for it. So he eventually won out. Singer was freed from prison, but it didn't actually change the libel law. This wouldn't come until, after the whole independence thing. But yeah, this was a whole issue with how Britain did things versus how the colonies were trying to do things. And here we have Singer, and I guess this other guy, the book doesn't really go into who this other guy is, but I guess he was like the royal newspaper editor. But there's Singer being exonerated and carried out on people's shoulders. That was just something you did. Right. So yeah. So between the religious and political awakenings, um, there was a lot of push against traditional authority. Now, it did bring some groups together. We saw, the strengthening of various denominations and even cross-class alliances. It also split them from these methods of control that were being used to run the colonies. But this was not some big melting pot moment. This was not, oh, we're all Americans now. People still thought of themselves as where they were from. They were still, English or French or German or whatever. Or more specifically, they were from whatever colony they were in. They were, from Pennsylvania, or they were from New Jersey or New York or whatever. There was not this identity of North America as a whole, or the American colonies as a whole. And we're going to see that even well into the war. Literally, Washington has a hard time getting his troops to come with him from New York, or from Massachusetts to New York, because they're like, well, New York men should be the ones taking care of New York. It's like, guys, come on. I need you all to come with me. So it was a whole thing. Needless to say, these distinctions still remain: religious, class, and racial, and oftentimes these will be exacerbated by the movements. And so while some of this authority did wane, much of it still stuck around. So while there was a lot of change, none of it really truly went away. It was still around. It was just tempered somewhat. And that's it for chapter 4. Yeah. All right. Let's at least start chapter 5, because it's wherever my mouse is. Getting into Wars and Empires, which is to say, we're starting with the 7 Years' War, which I refuse to call the French and Indian War because that's a dumb name, which I will get into in just a moment. 1750 to 1774, obviously we're getting right up to the time, which is going to be chapter 6. So this chapter is mostly lead up to the Revolution stuff. And while this is called the opening battles, because that's what this part of the chapter was called, all of it talks about stuff that has nothing to do with opening battles. Albany Congress, meant to bring the colonial leaders and Iroquois Confederacy together, especially because while the British had the most numerous settlers, other groups like the French had lots of forts along the frontier, and also lots of alliances with the natives. So their main intention was to ally with the Iroquois, because the Iroquois were a major power. And as we've said previously, the Iroquois' main decision was to stay out of future struggles, because they knew that if they didn't, their entire tribe would be wiped out. So lots of tribes like the Delaware, Huron, Miami, and Shawnee, sorry, um, allied with the French because, as we've seen, for those of you that did the paper, which most of you, um, the French had a relatively small impact on the region. You know, they mostly had forts and trading posts and whatnot. Um, Most of the groups really wanted to just play the Europeans off of each other. They worked with whoever they felt like could help them the most. But as we've seen with a lot of the wars, especially up in New England, they would just swap. They would swap sides, mainly because they believed that a stalemate between these powers would be better than a single power completely taking over the region, which isn't untrue, because look what happens as soon as the United States becomes a thing and we start taking over. We start pushing the natives west, and then we start settling west, and then we start pushing the natives further west, and then eventually we, like, mostly genocide them. Yeah, they weren't wrong. But if you had two European powers constantly fighting each other, and they're too busy killing other Europeans than consolidating the land that they're holding, then they'll mostly leave you alone. I mean, sure, the natives were still, like, getting destroyed, but they weren't the main focus. So in 1755, we had this major push under General Edward Braddock. He was sent by the English to take Fort, whatever the hell that is, Duquesne. Got himself killed for the trouble. The British really loved their martyrs, so congratulations, General Braddock, you got yourself killed. More importantly for us, though, his second in command was one young George Washington. There's a lot of this, a lot of, if we really went in depth into this war, a lot of the guys fighting this war are going to be major names in the future conflict. So, yeah. So this is, technically the war hasn't started yet. This battle here just happened because the French and English just hate each other that much. Yeah. This is all I could find for the Albany Congress. I don't know. I don't see any Iroquois there. Here's Braddock being carried off of the field, bleeding out dramatically. Because again, England loves their martyrs. So, 1756, France and England officially declared war on one another. This is, again, what we call here in North America the French and Indian War, but that's a dumb name because it implies that it was the English against the French and their native allies. But the English had plenty of native allies of their own. Also, it was not just here. It took place over in Europe, where Austria, Russia, Sweden, and Spain joined France, and Prussia and Portugal joined Britain. And also, it happened not just in Europe, but also in India, the West Indies, and the Philippines. This is this is what a lot of historians like to joke is the true First World War. I mean, it's not, but it did sort of take place all over the world. So yeah, I mean, these were all colonial holdings where, you know, the Europeans had colonists. That's why there was warfare all over these places, which honestly that's also kind of why the world wars happened the way they did. But yeah. So by 1757, William Pitt showed up in North America and took charge of things because we were actually getting our butts kicked pretty good. The French had lots of forts. We couldn't really make any moves on them, and their native allies were whipping us. So, and we didn't really have any kind of solid strategy. We were just sort of like hitting out at random, and that didn't go very well. So Prussia was holding the line in Europe. I could talk the entire rest of the class about Prussia, but I'm not going to because that's not our class. By the way, if you're not aware, Prussia is the core of what will become Germany. In case you've never heard the word Prussia before, Prussia is like the nucleus of what would eventually grow into Germany. So when I say Prussia, just think Germany but smaller. So Pitt rallied forces in North America, and he helped Washington take that thing again. Tecumseh, I don't know. It was renamed Pittsburgh in his honor, so he's the reason we have Pittsburgh. So if you ever want to blame somebody for Pittsburgh, it was William Pitt's fault. This is not a true statement. Prussia did not defeat Austria and Russia in Europe. Prussia did fight Austria and Russia to a stalemate. Also, there was weird stuff happening in Russia, and the Tsar was an idiot, and then the Tsar got killed, and then the Tsar, took over. A lot of weird things were happening in Europe, but the end result was Prussia, Austria, and Russia were now no longer in the fight, which meant that England didn't really have to worry about Europe anymore because France, Spain, and Portugal were more concentrated on their European powers, or not European power, their colonial powers. Also, there was like war crimes happening in India at the time. England and France had quite a few holdings in India, and they were really letting each other have it there. They also had quite a few Indian soldiers under their command. And the thing about India, just a quick aside, while they were all technically like under the Sultan, each Indian prince was his own independent power. So they were all like rivals with each other. So just like with here in America, where the European powers showed up and the natives would choose who they worked with, you showed up in India, and if one prince decided to work with England and another prince decided he didn't like that guy, he'd work with France. So that's just how that happened in India. And yeah, there was a lot of really bad stuff happening in India while this was going on. So we had General Jeffrey Amherst captured Fort Ticonderoga and Crown Point on Lake Champlain. Was that a naval battle? I don't know if it mentioned. It just says Prussia defeated the French. The French, Austrian, and Russian forces in Europe. No, they didn't. I mean, sort of, but jeez. Okay. No, it doesn't say. All right. General James Wolfe led an outnumbered force against Quebec. You don't do that. If you're ever, I mean, I don't know how many of us are gonna to lead a fight against a siege, but if you're ever besieging a fortified location, you need at least 3 times as many guys as the defenders have. You don't fight against an overwhelming numerical force if you are besieging the other guy. If they have defensive fortifications, they are already at an advantage. If they have more guys than you, you are going to get killed. James Wolfe and most of his dudes got killed. They somehow won this? I don't know how. Most of his men didn't get to see them winning it, but they somehow won it, won control of Canada, so good for him, I guess. He got himself killed, which, again, the British love a martyr, so good for him. But you don't do that. That was... He shouldn't have won. He should have died. He did die, but all his men should have died, and he should have been remembered as, like, a terrible, terrible leader. Rather than the hero, because, again, the British love their generals dying in battle. Anyway, here is William Pitt. And, of course, James Wolfe dramatically dying after being shot. Oh, and also, one of their native allies, because it wasn't just the English fighting the French and Indians. So despite all this, the war still drug on for another 3 years. As I've mentioned several times, this was the 7 Years' War, so it took 7 years to finish. So it finally ended in 1763 with the Peace of Paris. And this is often the case with European squabbles. Whichever side is clearly winning will make this big move at the last minute to take a lot of extra territory they know they can't hold. So when it comes to the treaty, they can graciously give land back to the defeated power as like goodwill for the peace treaty, because they know they can't hold it all because it's too much land and they don't have enough troops to garrison it and blah 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 blah. So they gave up some land back to France. Cuba and the Philippines were returned to Spain in exchange for Florida, because Britain's just like, screw it, let's just go ahead and have the whole East Coast now. Let's just stop bumping into Florida. The United States, for those of you that stick around for me next semester, we take Cuba and the Philippines from Spain, so that becomes a thing. Also, this doesn't last super long, but for the sake of not confusing you with maps for a little while, France gave Spain all of Louisiana for their help in the war. So this map I'm about to show you guys, Spain has like all of everything west of the Mississippi for a little while, and then eventually France gets it back because I guess Spain doesn't want it. I don't know. We'll get to that later. Britain, though, now had everything east of the Mississippi, all the way to Canada, and also a fair number of Caribbean islands, also most of India, which again doesn't really affect us too much, but that is where a lot of their focus goes for a while, which is why they didn't really fight us as hard as they could have in the war, because they were like, well, you know, I mean, it's a pride blow, but we got so much going on over here in India, it's not that big a deal. What are we going to lose? Like, tobacco? We got opium in India, guys. Come on. There were lots of problems, though. There was still the issue of territory between settlers and natives because, well, obviously, as I've said many times, property lines don't exist. Territorial lines don't exist. They're made up. They're a line on a map. Um, and especially with people who don't believe in land ownership, it's not really gonna be something that can be agreed upon. Um, and the natives that were, say, working with the British, who had helped the British in these battles and had claimed territory from oftentimes their native rivals, um, those claims were not honored by the British because the British. And the natives, they had been hostile to Britain for, see what, this is 1700s now, at least 200 years. um, the ones that had been, working with France or working with Spain are now under nominally British control, or at least on land that is technically now under British authority, are not going to be just like, oh, well, now we're under the British flag, so we're going to be the friends of the British now. That's not how that works. So now you've got a lot of hostile natives on, big air quotes, British land. And then finally, war costs a lot of money. So Britain's debt doubled, which is going to lead directly into a lot of the acts and taxes and whatnot that we see towards the end of this chapter. So just keep that in mind. So this was 1763, post 7 Years' War. So you've got the colonies here, you've got the land that was taken in the war, and then of course all of Canada here, or at least all of Canada that was claimed. This whole thing is separate. Louisiana was given to Spain, so you've got all of this is now Spanish. There's a few islands out here that are French, but for the most part, France is not really involved in North America as much. Also, we got like Russian Alaska over here, but don't worry about that. That's not going to be. We're going to mention that like once, I think, next semester, where it's like, we bought we bought Alaska from Russia, and it was seen as a bad idea at the time, and then we struck lots of natural resources. They were like, hey, maybe this was a fine investment. And that's all we talk about Alaska. So, yeah, don't worry about that part. All right, if I get one further, I think we'll be we'll be as far as my Tuesday Thursday class is. So let's get a little further and we'll be set. So, following the war, and also we'll be able to do this, and I'll be able to talk about what this guy is. The proclamation line of 1763? Yeah. Where's the mouse? This guy here. All right. So, needless to say, we've got all this land now, and settlers want to move into it. In particular, the Ohio River Valley. It's very, very rich land, very good for planting stuff. And again, most people are farmers anyway, so ship them off. Needless to say, though, these lands have plenty of natives there that don't want the British there, because they've been working with the French or the Spanish for literally a century or two now, and the British have been enemies with them for literally a century or two now. So compared to the French that had been largely living alongside them, or at least trading with them, the English settlers did their best to just straight up drive them out because of the English. So there was resistance among the natives and reprisals among the settlers. There was the event of Pontiac and the Paxton Boys, Pontiac was a tribal leader of the Ottawa tribe, followed the teachings of the tribe Neolin. If I remember right, it was like if they were to drive out all the Europeans, then the natives would be able to rule the world again, or something along those lines. It was very like, we have to get rid of these Europeans. Series of attacks on British forts and settlements. The Paxton Boys were from Paxton, Pennsylvania. They attacked natives regardless of their allegiance, so they would attack like natives that were allied with the English, or natives that were completely pacifist. They just roll in and start murdering them. And then when the native tribes fought back, the Paxton Boys even marched on Philadelphia demanding protection from the local government because they had stirred up the bee's hive and now they were running scared. So this resulted in the proclamation line that I showed you guys on the previous map. Proclamation line of 1763 denied colonists the right to settle west of the Appalachians, which caused resentment among the colonists because in their minds, winning the war had granted them the right to move onto the land, because technically, with winning the war, England had won that land from the French. And being English colonists, English citizens as they were, and having fought in that war, it made sense to them, because this was how England had always done things, that they would be able to move onto this land and settle it. But with the proclamation line of 1763, the English government was trying to avoid antagonizing the natives as much as they could, at least in the short term. I'm definitely not trying to say that England is trying to be nice to the natives, because they're English. They don't know how to be nice. But it upset the colonists, because the colonists were like, oh, well, you're not letting us, you're being tyrannical and blah, blah, blah. So, yeah. So here's the Paxton Boys, just murdering natives, as they did. Another proclamation line again? Yeah, here we go. And then this PowerPoint slide that I just stole off the internet. So here you have before the war, and this disputed line, or disputed territory in the Ohio River Valley, and then post-war where all this is now British land. And there is this, we're not going to talk too much about the 7 Years' War, but like there's this idea, well, I mean, if I were to say, hey, what's the main reason the French and English went to war over the 7 Years' War? It's typically over this. It's typically over the Ohio River Valley. Now, as far as Prussia and all that, that's a whole. I have a whole separate class for that. But the colonists felt like the reason they went to war was to take specifically this land. I mean, all this other stuff's good too, but the main reason they wanted it was this. But now they're not allowed to move into it, so they're pissed. So yeah, that's a big part of it. And also, there's the whole like, the soldiers are being stationed in the colonies to, quote, keep them safe from the encroaching natives. We'll get more into that next time. But they have to pay for it because stationing soldiers isn't free. And it's a whole thing. I think, yeah, that's it over that. So, we'll get into more stuff later. I'll see you guys on Wednesday. Yeah, I'll put I'll put chapter 4 up on Blackboard later today. See y'all on Wednesday.